GERETTE BUGLION, thanks so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs all the way from Vermont, USA. You are an author, an educator, offering cult education and recovery, having spent 18 years in a New York-based therapy cult. Your book, An Everyday Cult, is out now, and as we'll see, is an account of how coercive groups are being forced to use increasingly subtle techniques in order to exert control over their members. So how are you doing, GERETTE? You certainly seem to lead a busy life, not just as an author and educator, but facilitating writing classes and podcasting as well.
Indeed, Mark. It is a delight to be here. And yes, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I do lead a busy life. The work with facilitating writing workshops, that's really, I think I would say, my greatest love. That is, working with people who have recovered from these kinds of groups that you focus on in Talk Beliefs, and supporting people to find their voice through the writing. And the podcasting, I wish I could say that was more active right now. That is a little bit on hold, but we'll be coming back again in September or October, with a new look and a new orientation. So that's to be continued.
Well, before we learn about the cult that held sway over your life for nearly 2 decades, let's just go right back to the beginning. GERETTE, where did you grow up, and can you describe the road that led you to the therapy cult that took hold of your life?
Indeed. I grew up in New York State, in the northeastern part of the United States. And I am the middle child of 7 kids, so 3 older and 3 younger. And as a middle child, I was kind of got the best and the worst of everything. We were an Irish Catholic family. So Irish-Italian Catholic. So we were the classic kind of big family. My mom was Irish, my dad was Italian. Both of them were Catholic. So I grew up knowing that I was Catholic, and yet we lived on a farm. The first few years of my life, we did not farm. We were in a very urban, suburban area. Yeah. And then we moved to a more rural part of New York State, and we started dairy farming. And once we started farming, my relationship to, and our entire family's relationship to going to church really shifted. So we were those really kind of bad Catholics that would only show up to church on Easter and Christmas. Mm-hmm. And those days we would, have to milk the cows early or late in order to get to church on time. But we were not a terribly religious family, although there were certain things like, as I mentioned, we were a large family. We would always, say a blessing at the meal, every meal. And, I'd say that I really grew up in a pretty normal dysfunctional, farm family. My parents were both good people. There was no significant abuse. I was very fortunate in that way, and I truly loved growing up on a farm. That was, I'd say, kind of a core part of my identity. As I got older, that kind of my connection to animals and nature has always been a strong part of my life. Being a child of a large family, I kind of naturally fell into working with children in daycare centers and became an elementary school teacher. So that was kind of a natural extension of my childhood, was my work in teaching.
In your book, An Everyday Cult, you reveal that you were drawn to a self-help group called the Center for Transformational Learning, or CTL, and that you ended up staying in it for 18 years. But before we find out about life within CTL, can you tell us about how you discovered this group and why it was so seductive?
Well, as I mentioned, I was a teacher, and I made a shift in my teaching career to working in a Waldorf school. And Waldorf education became a big part of my life. And I learned now in retrospect that even though the Waldorf school that I was a part of was not overtly cultic, as some Waldorf schools are, there were elements of my life as a teacher that I think kind of set me up for this interest in kind of this psycho-spiritual world. And I became very interested in personal growth. I became interested in working with dreams, and also interested in kind of bettering myself as a human being. Like, how could I become a better person? And it was that desire, that kind of idealism, that led me into meeting Doug. I call him Doug. That's not his real name. I call him Doug in my book, An Everyday Cult. And I'm actually not public about his real name for a variety of reasons, but in large part because I don't want to get caught up in any, or I don't want a distraction from my work in cult recovery and education today. I don't want it to be distracted by a potential lawsuit. So I don't mention. I keep that private, as well as discovering the entity that he created, which is I call the Center for Transformational Learning. And there was something incredibly wonderful about this organization. A couple of my colleagues were deeply involved in it, and they were just learning so much. And I could see this kind of spark in their eyes, and there was like a self-reflective quality that they had. And I was pregnant at the time that my colleagues started seeing Doug. And so I made the decision to myself that it was not the time for me to be doing something new. I really wanted to make sure that I could bring my child into the world before committing to some new program or entity. So I waited, and in that waiting period, I can now see that waiting period actually, there was like this building of anticipation, because I kept watching my friends getting more and more involved, and there was a kind of, FOMO, fear of missing out, and an envy that I think in a way kind of set me up for that. Like, I really wanted it to work. So by the time that I started, 6-8 months later, I was really ready, and I wanted this. I very much wanted this to work. And
who doesn't want to get involved in self-improvement, right?
Exactly. Yes, it was a very innocent beginning.
Well, eventually you found yourself part of the group. Gerette, what is CTL all about, and what was day-to-day life like in this organization?
So the reason I call my book An Everyday Cult is that in some ways it looked like I just led a normal life, because everything that we did was just taking classes and doing different things. I had my every other weekly or every other week sessions that I had with Doug. And, as I mentioned, or perhaps I didn't mention yet, that I was involved for 18 years doing this work. So there were, various stages of this. My husband was also doing the work at the same time. And it was all centered on working our dreams. So the dreams that we have at night, those dreams were analyzed. We would bring them to Doug, our teacher, and he would work them in this very specific way that also involved astrology, a particular form of astrology. And then those dreams would actually, we would come out of each session with Doug with an assignment of what we called homework. And that homework then became this life that is really what actually I now see was part of what Robert J. Lifton calls the thought terminating cliche.
Oh, yes.
Or that process of terminating our thinking. And so instead of accessing and reflecting on, is this a good idea? Does this make sense? We were instructed to use these emotionally charged moments from our dreams, and they would become infused with all the more emotion through processing them with Doug. And we were instructed to bring those emotionally charged moments into our day as an anchor to connect us with the divine world. And by doing this, this process would be a transformational process that would bring us closer and closer to our divine self. Mm-hmm. And we would sever from our pathological side, so the part of us that was in a way evil or disregarded, or any part of us that could not be trusted and should not be trusted and was actually getting in the way of our ability to have an authentic relationship with the divine. So that was kind of like the gist of it and of the work itself, and it became increasingly more and more all-consuming as the years went on. And the reason I call it an everyday cult is that, there wasn't any tithing. We didn't live in a community altogether. As I said, it looked like we were just kind of taking some classes, doing some cool things. There were people some people would be more involved and some people less. When CTL, when the Center for Transformational Learning was established, it was actually established when I was about 4 or 5 years after I started. And when it was established, there was this, things got more intense. And we also started doing retreats. And if you became a member of the Center for Transformational Learning, you were required to commit to a certain number of retreats a year. You were required to attend a certain number of classes a year. You would also have to write these confessional emails. So those emails would be identifying, as I mentioned, the part of ourself, the pathological part of ourself that was getting in the way of becoming a truly authentic woman of God, as was the goal. We would have to identify everything that was impeding our ability to be there, and that was largely constructed by Doug through the way that he interpreted the dreams. So he might interpret a certain dream. Let's see. So, for example, if I'm, complaining in the dream to my husband about something, that would be extremely, there was this thing about a couch, so I'm trying to talk to my husband about a couch, and just a practical life matter. But it became this huge issue that my pathology was trying to control my husband and trying to tank was used, kind of, I don't know if you use that in England or not, but, to tank your finances, which would mean to sabotage them, by buying this unnecessary thing, the couch. And so then I would have to write these confessional emails all about this. And I would not only have to write the emails, I would have to read the emails of everyone else. So I would spend hours on emails. So instead of sleeping, I would be catching up on people's emails, because if you didn't read other people's emails, you were a bad student, a bad follower, practitioner of the work. The work, we called it the work. And, you know, throughout this time, like the retreats became very intense. There were some, I describe in my book a few extremely kind of troubling moments that included interventions of like strangling and not actual cutting off of breath, but more figurative of someone placing hands around my neck to teach me that, to remind me that what I said was BS, you know, was not to be trusted. So there were interventions like that. And at the same time, Doug would say at a retreat or at a class, you know, people might call us a cult, but we know that anyone can come and go anytime.
Oh, yeah.
And the truth is, you know, people did come and go. In fact, I left the organization 3 different times in those 18 years. So it was okay to leave, but the psychological controls of the need to stay in, the missing out on, you know, my, like the reason for leaving would always be that, oh, you're just not strong enough in the work. Go out back into the world, take a break, come back when you're ready. And when you're ready, then you can do the deeper work.
And those confessional emails, Gerette, that reminds me of like the collateral in NXIVM and groups like that, where you bare your soul, but they've got dirt on you now. So if you do upset them in some way, they can always hold that against you.
Exactly. They can definitely, and there would, Doug actually had a term for it. He would call it, it's funny, I've just put my hand on my back pocket. He's like, you can take out that card anytime and play that card of what you know. He taught us to do, you know, perform this kind of dream work for others. That was another part of the training, of the involvement, was that we were training to become practitioners. So he called us pulling out the Ace of Spades. So if we knew something, you know, that was collateral on a person, we could pull it out of our back pocket at any time to, in a way, hold power over a person. He also called it gaining turf. So we were like literally taught to gain more turf on a person's psyche, so that they could come to see how misguided they were. You know, do you understand that kind
yes.
of, the complexity there is great. And yet it was also based on some truisms, which is kind of like that, I call it the gotcha formula, which is, you know, where a teacher might say something that's truthful, and you know, we're kind of nodding our heads, and it really resonates, and it seems really accurate and right on, like that's, and then the next thing, there's something that's partially true and partially not true, but since we've already heard something positive and truthful before, we're still nodding our heads. And then the next thing is a little less truth, more, you know, BS or falsehoods, to the point that we're hearing stuff that is, you know, in many ways completely unfounded and unethical. But that buy-in has already happened. So they gotcha. like that process is that's a formula that a friend of mine who's has worked many years actually in corporate business talked about that formula, and it's like, oh, that formula applies to cultic groups in a big way as well.
Well, you remained with CTL for 18 long years, but those years were not without more than a few periods of doubt for you. So can you tell us about those doubts and red flags that eventually led you to leave the group once and for all?
Yeah, I wish that there were more doubts, I have to say, Mark, because truthfully, from a really conscious perspective, my leaving was quite sudden. In retrospect, I can look back and see that there were a series of events in the last couple of years that were very significant, that I think started to create the cracks in the cultic wall that my psyche was trapped in. One of those was a beloved member of our community died by suicide. And that was an incredibly troubling experience. And even though at the time I did not see that there was a relationship between his troubles and CTL and Doug's work, that was kind of verified for me only after I got out. But there were other things as well. Like I noticed that some of the teachers who were very excited about always doing the away retreat, so where Doug and his wife would travel to different places, and suddenly they were needing more people to help with that. And I was asked to be one of the people or key person in a away retreat that took place in Canada, and I took that as a real honor. And I was told that I was going to be treated really well because I'd be their key person. And when I drove separately from them, met them out at this place, and then it turned out that I wasn't treated any differently than I was normally treated, because I was not one of the teachers. I had never achieved, kind of in the 18 years that I was involved, I was always one of the low ones on the totem pole. It was as if I couldn't ever, the glass ceiling in my group was quite low, and I could never get through it. And but the little cracks were that the other teachers weren't wanting to do that anymore. And why am I being sent out there? And actually, it's not that pleasant an experience. I'm not getting anything exciting out of it. In fact, I felt really kind of used and unseen, but I couldn't allow myself to actually articulate that thought in my own mind. When it was literally in the last year that those things were happening. And then, then it really became, at that point, I have to say, Mark, I was so entrenched that I couldn't make a decision without Doug. And that became, I think, more and more unbearable for me.
So what was the final straw that caused you to leave the group behind? And what was life like after CTL?
There was a crisis in the organization. And on a particular day, actually May 28th, 2014, 6 of the head leaders of the organization left, as I said, on the same day. And that created this enormous rift. And a psychological disconnect that was powerfully disorienting. And And we had one last meeting. I was part of what was called the executive committee, and I believed that the executive committee was the decision-making body of the organization. But now, once I got out, I could see that there were like 4 other tiers above the executive committee. But Doug allowed us to have one last meeting. And in that meeting, and I will say, like literally at the very end of that meeting, one of the teachers, who was in a way, I would say that she was the most sensitive and gentle-spirited of all the people in the organization. She was a poet, had experienced trauma as a child, and that teacher, who I had revered, described how Doug would call her multiple times and berate her hour after hour. And suddenly, something snapped, something shifted in my psyche, because I knew without a shadow of a doubt that what she was describing was truth. And that truth did not match up to the pedestal that I had put Doug on all those 18 years. And that created this like cognitive dissonance. And in that moment, it was, I call it like, it was the major crack that let in the light. You know, those other experiences, those more minor doubts, kind of red flags, those were maybe little fissures, but this was like, whoa, big gap. And it let in the light that is really what freed me from the cultic grip that I was involved in for all those 18 years. And that, I call it snapping because it was so quick. It was this mental release from bondage. And I left that meeting, and by the time I drove home, it's a 40-minute drive through a long, dark wooded, through the woods, back up to my home. By the time I got home, I knew that I had shifted, and I stood in my driveway and I experienced this, kind of profound moment of realizing that some grip that had possessed my life had left. And I literally walked in, and my husband was already sleeping. Our kids were asleep as well. I woke him up and I said, honey, we need to talk. And he expressed in that time that he had been waiting for me. He had left 2 years before me. And I think that may have also been another part of that experience in those last couple of years. In some ways, it helped me to go deeper into the group. But because he had left, I think there was also another way that, he, my husband, who, and we're still together today, that he had enough doubt to leave. That also must have played into my experiences of doubt. So, I got out as I emerged, and literally in a period of days and weeks, I untangled myself from Doug, from the organization. At the time, I was actually working for Doug, working for other people in the group. And there was this slow untangling, but I never once looked back in terms of thinking, I'm making a mistake. There was a huge amount of grief that, what I thought to be true was not true. This organization that I had been so dedicated to, really had such tragic failings. And I had been, as I had mentioned, I was a Waldorf teacher before I joined the group. And as a Waldorf teacher, my focus was actually in special education, and I was a certified special educator. So I was very keenly interested in how the brain functioned. And when I got out, I was like, how did this happen to me? Like, how did I, a grown woman, I went in my 30s. Like, how is it possible that I gave up that much agency as an educated, caring, like responsible person? And it was the process. At that point, I really dedicated my life to understanding how control works, how coercion works, the nature of manipulation and power over abuse, and the complexity of the systems that lead someone into becoming, losing their sense of self and giving up their sense of autonomy to a group, or it can also be a controlling in a controlling relationship. The very same dynamics can take place. But that's my work. That's my passion today. That I'm really dedicated to supporting others. It's an incredibly humbling process, and there is no shame. I have learned that the hard way, that the complexity of systems and structures that are used to control individuals are all built on very natural human traits. It's just part of being human. And some of us get more involved and really lose sense of our of our deeper autonomy. And the work, this work with supporting and encouraging people to recognize what they were involved in and bringing self-compassion into the narrative is very important.
Well, today you are fully reoriented back to being an educator, specializing in cult dynamics. You are a co-founder of IGotOut.org, an organization that supports and provides resources for people who have escaped coercive groups. You've also written a book about your experiences. Gerette, why did you call this book An Everyday Cult, and what do you hope readers will get out of it?
It's called An Everyday Cult because it looked like something other than a cult. And what I've come to see in that experience, my kind of nerdy educator self that woke up after my 18 years of being kind of held in that grip of mind control, what I started to see is, when I woke up, I started to see how these dynamics that lead people into controlling cultic groups or religions actually exist everywhere on every level of society, and they can manifest in any kind of group. So part of my intention with the choice of the book title is to not in any way condone these dynamics, but to shine a light on them. Because the more that we can see how these dynamics exist and recognize mechanisms of control, the greater off we all are in terms of preventing involvement, and perhaps also being able to recognize when a loved one is maybe getting involved in something that's questionable, to bring a question to them. I literally just had this experience, which was so beautiful, where someone called me about a group their son was getting involved in, and I was able to offer a little bit of information just to the parents, and they were able to relay some questions, bring some questions and perspective to their son, who then actually made the decision, and this was a young adult, to not get involved. And it's because of, clear, simple questions and holding compassionate space and staying in relationship with each other. That process can be ever so helpful. Of course, it can be much more complex than that. And very often it can be, most of the time it is much more involved. But I'd like to mention, if it's okay, Mark, that I have my second book coming out, which is called Writing to Reckon Journal. Writing to Reckon is the name of the writing classes that I've been facilitating for the last 2.5, almost 3 years. And there are 4 people who have gotten out of controlling religion or spiritual abuse or occultic abuse in one form or another. And my book, the Writing to Reckon Journal, is a book of writing prompts that are kind of based on the different stages of cultic involvement that I experienced. And they're the stages that are also kind of outlined in my book, An Everyday Cult. My hope is that by offering this as a journal for others, people can write on their own time in the comfort of their own home, or in the quiet of a cafe or wherever they want to do their writing. Because writing in and of itself is so incredibly helppful. I was fortunate to learn about the work of Dr. Dan Siegel when I first got out. He's a neuropsychologist, and he talks about the importance of creating a coherent narrative out of any traumatic experiences. He's not focused on cultic work, but has focused on trauma instead. So if we can take our traumas and find the words that express them and become coherent and communicate to ourselves and to others what our experiences were, I have had the incredible honor of hearing many, many people's stories, and the integration that takes place just through that process is absolutely life-affirming. And it's that experience that also fuels my work with I Got Out. I am incredibly proud to be able to say that I Got Out is now in the process of becoming a nonprofit organization. There's a lot of work involved in that, and we're doing it. We've had our first board meeting. It's all in process, and this work of supporting survivors to share their story when and if it's safe to do so. That telling of the story and expressing it through the written word, or expressing it through a song or dance or movement, anything, it's extremely affirming. So I hope that all the wonderful listeners of Talk Beliefs would be interested, if they have not already explored igotout.org. That's the one website I hope that people will really explore, as well as, of course, my own. But it's really what I am incredibly honored to be a part of, bringing that work into the world today.
Well, it's been great talking to you, Gerette, and I just want to thank you for all the work you're doing to educate the public on these very important topics. I will leave links to your book, website, and podcast in the description below, and hopefully we can have you back on the show in the very near future.
That would be such an honor, Mark. It is a delight to be with you today. I also really want to thank you for the important work that you do through Talk Beliefs. It's quite a beautiful tribute that you have created here. Thank you.